Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a relationship that's really getting a lot of attention right now. It's the increasingly complex and frankly strained dynamic between the United States and South Africa.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation with global implications, and I think
Yeah.
people are really asking why this has become such a flashpoint, such a point of international interest.
Exactly. So our mission, our goal in this deep dive is to try and move beyond just the immediate headlines
Mm,
and really unpack the core issues that are fueling this tension.
right. We've gathered quite a range of sources to help us get, hopefully, a clearer and more insightful picture of what's truly driving the disagreements between these two countries.
And what really brought this all into sharp focus just recently was that meeting in Washington, D.C. You had President Ramaphosa of South Africa, President Trump,
And Elon Musk.
and Elon Musk, yeah, which definitely adds another layer to consider as we dig into this.
It really does. And, to understand where we are now, it's probably helpful to just cast our minds back a bit to the early post-apartheid years.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa back then, it was marked by a huge amount of optimism, right?
Yeah, a real sense of admiration, I think, for how South Africa handled that transition. I remember reading President Clinton's remarks. He actually held South Africa up as an example.
Global example of reconciliation.
Yeah,
I felt like a watershed moment.
it really did. And yet, fast forward, 30 years or so?
Hmm.
And now we find ourselves in a situation that, well, many are describing it using terms like mutual disappointment and even mistrust.
It's quite a shift. So what happened? What are the key things that have, led us down this path?
Well, one of the absolute central points of contention, it seems, revolves around South Africa's domestic policies, specifically this expropriation act that President Ramaphosa signed. Was it January this year?
Yes, January 2025. And, okay, so what does it do? At its core, this act gives the South African government the power to acquire land for public purposes and, importantly, in the public interest. Now, that can cover quite a range of things: infrastructure, public services, environmental protection, land reform, obviously.
Probably trying to get a more equitable distribution of resources.
Exactly. And while the act does say fair compensation should be provided, it also, and this is the key point, it opens the door for expropriation without compensation in certain specific circumstances.
Okay. And it replaced an older law.
Yeah. It replaced a 1975 law from the apartheid era, which was seen as pretty legally ambiguous, especially around how compensation actually worked.
Got it. Now, this is where you see a really, really strong reaction from the U.S. side, particularly the Trump administration. They've voiced, pretty significant concerns. They're framing this almost as persecution.
Aimed specifically at the white minority Afrikaner population.
Right, suggesting it basically allows the government to just seize agricultural land, their land, without paying anything for it.
And this feeds into that whole narrative, the very controversial white genocide narrative that you see popping up in some circles.
Yeah, and figures like Stephen Miller and, as we mentioned, Elon Musk have been quite vocal in, let's say, amplifying those feelings.
But what's the view from South Africa itself? How do they see it?
Well, and this is where it gets fascinating because it's viewed through a completely different lens, isn't it?
Completely. They argue pretty forcefully that this law isn't just policy, it's a constitutional imperative.
Meaning
It's a necessary step, they believe, to address the really deep-seated historical inequalities that stem directly from apartheid.
Okay.
They point to the facts on the ground. Even today, something like 70% of the land is still owned by white individuals.
Who make up only about, 7% of the population?
Exactly. And at the same time, you've got over half the black population in South Africa officially categorized as poor, with very limited access to land.
So it's about redressing that imbalance.
That's the argument. President Ramaphosa's office, they've been very clear, saying this act is not intended as some kind of confiscation tool, but rather as a vital policy to achieve a more equitable distribution of wealth and land. It's also probably worth noting, contextually, that as of now, mid-May 2025, we haven't actually seen widespread reports of uncompensated seizures happening under this new law.
Right, that's an important point. And, okay, beyond the land issue, there are also these Black economic empowerment laws, the BEE laws. How do they fit into this picture and the U.S. reaction?
Well, the BEE laws, they're designed to boost the economic participation of groups who are disadvantaged under apartheid. So basically, businesses need to meet certain targets.
Targets for what?
For things like ownership by marginalized groups, management diversity, skills development, supporting smaller enterprises, socioeconomic development. It's quite broad.
All aimed at empowerment.
Right. But these laws have also drawn criticism, again, notably from someone like Elon Musk. He's actually called them, I believe, racist ownership laws,
Wow.
suggesting they've had a negative impact on his company, Starlink, trying to operate in South Africa.
So that raises these big questions, doesn't it, about how different economic approaches, different priorities are seen by each country.
Absolutely. It highlights a real clash in perspective on how to address historical economic disparity.
Okay, so we have these pretty significant disagreements on domestic policy, land, economic structure. What's the other major pillar driving this friction?
The second really crucial area is South Africa's foreign policy. Its choices on the world stage, its geopolitical alignments.
The non-aligned stance.
Exactly. The U.S. has become increasingly, let's say, wary of South Africa's stated non-alignment, especially given its strengthening ties with countries like Russia.
Through BRICS, for example.
Through BRICS, yeah, and also with China and Iran. There's a definite skepticism in the U.S. about this non-alignment. Many see these partnerships as, well, potentially undermining U.S. strategic interests.
And there have been specific concerns raised, haven't there, beyond just general alignment?
Oh, yes. There have been reports, for instance, about military links with Russia and even some more alarming allegations about potential nuclear cooperation with Iran. Those sorts of things definitely raise red flags in Washington.
And then sort of linked to this alignment issue is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That seems to be a major point of divergence.
A huge one. Absolutely fundamental difference in position here. South Africa's taken a very, very strong pro-Palestine stance.
Including the ICJ case.
Yes, filing that case against Israel, the International Court of Justice, back in December 2023, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. That was a major move.
And a move that caused considerable anger in the U.S.
Oh, definitely. The U.S., being such a staunch ally of Israel, strongly condemns South Africa's actions, especially after the ICJ issued those provisional measures against Israel. It just highlights this widening gulf on a key international crisis.
And this divergence, it's had real-world diplomatic consequences too, right?
Yeah,
this wasn't just rhetoric.
No, it wasn't. We saw the U.S. take that pretty significant step of actually expelling the South African ambassador.
Really? Why?
It followed comments he apparently made referencing what he called a supremacist instinct in U.S. foreign policy.
Wow. So that kind of diplomatic fallout, it really underscores just how strained things have become, the level of mistrust there now.
It does, which, brings us right back to that meeting we mentioned earlier between Trump and Ramaphosa on May 21st.
Yeah, it sounds like that was framed as a potentially pivotal moment, a chance to address these deep-seated issues.
Yeah, many observers were calling it a critical conversation,
Yeah.
Maybe even, a last-ditch effort by Ramaphosa to try and salvage the relationship.
And potentially head off tougher U.S. actions, like
Yeah.
sanctions.
Exactly. Trying to avoid things like economic sanctions, tariffs, things that could really hurt the South African economy.
And Musk's presence at that meeting, we keep coming back to it, but it is notable. What do you think his role might have been there? Any sense?
Well, it certainly adds an interesting dynamic, doesn't it? You could interpret it in a few ways. Maybe he's there representing significant U.S. economic interests in South Africa.
Or
perhaps as someone whose views on South Africa's domestic policies, like BEE, kind of align with the Trump administration's concerns. It's hard to know for sure.
And what was Ramaphosa reportedly offering or hoping to achieve?
Reports suggested he was planning to propose a comprehensive trade deal, basically trying to sweeten the pot with increased market access in South Africa for the U.S.
And Starlink, given Musk was there.
The licensing for Starlink was almost certainly on the table as well, yeah. A potential bargaining chip, maybe.
But it sounds like Ramaphosa was walking a tightrope heading into that meeting. Could he realistically offer major concessions?
That was the huge challenge. He faced and still faces significant political constraints back home.
You mean backlash if he gives too much ground?
Precisely. Making big concessions on core issues like land reform or BEE that would likely trigger strong opposition within his own party and the country. But at the same time, the U.S. concerns are deep, especially on the foreign policy alignment.
So finding common ground, very difficult.
Extremely difficult. There was even speculation about President Trump potentially boycotting the G20 summit later this year, which South Africa is hosting. That would be a major diplomatic blow.
Yeah. And didn't we also see some of the sort of racial undertones bubble up around that time? I remember something about Senator Kaine questioning Secretary Rubio.
Yes, that was quite pointed. Kaine questioned Rubio about why the administration seemed to be prioritizing potential Afrikaner refugees over other groups facing persecution elsewhere. it definitely highlighted how racial dynamics were informing the U.S. perspective, or at least how it was being perceived.
So while the U.S. concerns often get framed around these specific issues, land reform, BEE, alleged discrimination against the white minority, it's important, isn't it, to see this within the broader context of human rights within South Africa?
Absolutely. That's a crucial piece for a fuller understanding. While the headlines might focus on the points of friction with the U.S., South Africa faces numerous other significant human rights challenges internally.
Such as?
Well, alarmingly high rates of gender-based violence, for one.
Yeah.
Femicide, rape. These are huge societal problems. There are also ongoing issues with basic infrastructure, like, believe it or not, pit latrines still being used in some schools.
Which has led to tragedies.
Exactly. Fatalities. Child malnutrition is still a serious concern. And human rights defenders, especially those working on land and housing rights like Abalali-based Muyondolo, they often face threats, intimidation, even violence.
So there are domestic challenges that go well beyond the issues the U.S. is focused on.
Definitely. Now, South Africa has taken some steps, like enacting the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act, but its full implementation is, well, still pending.
Okay.
And to be fair, it's also worth acknowledging South Africa's positive role in some international human rights areas, like championing a UN Human Rights Council resolution on the rights of intersex persons.
Yeah.
So it's complex.
It really is. And we can't really finish this discussion without directly tackling that highly charged claim of white genocide in South Africa. What's the reality there?
Yeah, it's vital to be extremely clear about this. That claim, the idea of an ongoing white genocide in South Africa, it's widely debunked by experts.
And the government denies it.
Firmly denies it.
Yeah.
Now, it is true that some white Afrikaners have sought and been granted refugee status in the U.S., citing fears of persecution. That has happened. But the South African government and many analysts argue that things like farm attacks, while tragically real and violent, are part of a much broader, serious crime problem that affects people across all racial groups. There isn't evidence of a systematic, state-sponsored campaign targeting white people for elimination.
And the rhetoric sometimes cited, like, kill the Boer.
That rhetoric is primarily associated with a specific far-left political party, the EFF. It's generally seen as nationalist political rhetoric. Inflammatory, yes, but distinct from official government policy or action.
And how do perspectives like, say, Ben Shapiro's fit in? He talks about racial reparations logic.
Right. That view frames South Africa's policies like BEE or land reform essentially as a form of reverse discrimination driven by a desire for reparations. It reflects a certain viewpoint, particularly in the U.S. conservative sphere.
But does it capture the full picture?
Well, critics would argue it often overlooks the persistent, deeply entrenched economic inequalities that are a direct, tangible legacy of decades of apartheid. The context matters hugely.
Absolutely. So as we try to synthesize all of this, try to pull the threads together, what are the key underlying drivers of these U.S.-South Africa tensions?
I think at the end of the day, you're looking at a really complex mix. You've got fundamentally different ways of seeing history and understanding its ongoing impact. You have clashing priorities, both domestically and in foreign policy. You have the undeniable influence of certain key individuals shaping the narrative.
Like Musk, perhaps.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And critically, you have the way racial narratives themselves are being used, sometimes weaponized by different actors involved in this whole situation.
It's a potent mix. And looking ahead then, what's your sense? Where does this relationship go from here?
Honestly, the future path is pretty uncertain. It's quite possible we could see relations deteriorate further, maybe more punitive measures for the U.S.
Is a
side.
reset possible?
South Africa might hope for one, but given how deeply entrenched the positions seem to be and the sheer range of contentious issues we've just discussed, a major positive turnaround feels, well, maybe unlikely in the short term.
Right. So as we conclude this deep dive, this look into the tangled web of the U.S.-South Africa relationship, maybe here's a thought for you, the listener, to mull over. When you consider these very different historical perspectives, these opposing policy goals, both at home and abroad, and the powerful way that racial narratives are playing into all of this, what does this whole complex situation tell us about the fundamental challenges of international diplomacy, especially when dealing with the long, enduring shadows of historical injustice?
It is a big question.
It is. And perhaps this discussion has maybe sparked your interest to dig a bit deeper yourself. You could look further into the specifics of the Expropriation Act or South Africa's evolving role within BRICS, or maybe the complex realities of the human rights situation on the ground there.
Lots to explore further.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.